They said the doctors gave up on the baby. They said there was nothing left to do. And yet, here I stand, holding what saved him. Maybe you're working for someone who never says thank you or cleaning up while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? I promise today's story will touch your heart. My name is Clara Rodriguez, and for 12 years I scrubbed the marble floors of one of Chicago's most exclusive Gold Coast mansions. The Whitmore estate stretched across 3 city lots, its limestone facade gleaming like old money should. Every morning at 5:30, I'd climb those steep servant stairs to the 3rd floor, my knees protesting each step, my worn sneakers silent on the Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars. The leather polish and expensive candles couldn't mask what I knew too well. This house held more secrets than love, more appearances than truth. I wore the same navy uniform every day, starched and pressed until it could stand on its own. Mrs. Whitmore insisted on it. "Presentation matters, Clara," she'd remind me, her voice sharp as winter wind off Lake Michigan. "We have a reputation to maintain." What she never said was how maintaining their reputation meant erasing mine. For 12 years, I existed in the spaces between their lives, straightening pillows they'd never touch, polishing silver they'd never use, preparing meals they'd barely acknowledge. The Whitmores had built their fortune through strategic investments in the Chicago commodities market. Their assets diversified across everything from grain futures to cryptocurrency. Mr. Whitmore's Bitcoin portfolio alone was worth more than some small country's GDP. Their wealth stretched beyond dollars and euros. They owned buildings, art collections, shares in companies whose names I couldn't pronounce. Money flowed through their lives like water through a broken dam, endless and careless. While I counted every penny I sent home to my daughter in Gary, Indiana, they threw away food that could feed a family for weeks. But that January morning, when the private ambulance pulled up to their circular drive, all their money couldn't buy what their newborn son needed most. Little Thomas had been born 3 months early, his tiny lungs struggling for every breath. The best doctors money could hire lined up in that pristine nursery, their faces grave behind expensive glasses. The neonatal intensive care unit they'd installed cost more than my lifetime salary, but technology has its limits. Sometimes the most precious things in life can't be purchased with stock dividends or investment returns. I remember standing in the doorway, invisible as always, watching their world crack open. Mrs. Whitmore clutched her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his Italian silk shirt. The lead physician, Dr. Morrison from Northwestern Memorial's premier NICU, spoke in hushed tones about antibody deficiencies and immune system failures. Their son's blood work showed levels that made even seasoned doctors shake their heads. No formula would work. No medication could replace what nature intended. The baby was slowly starving, his tiny body rejecting everything they tried to feed him. "We've exhausted every medical option," Dr. Morrison said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Without the proper nutrients and antibodies, I'm afraid—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. In that moment, all their millions felt as worthless as yesterday's newspaper. Their vast fortune, their carefully managed investment portfolio, their diversified assets, none of it mattered. Their child was dying, and money couldn't save him. That's when everything changed. That's when I stepped forward from the shadows where I'd lived for so long and offered the one thing their wealth couldn't buy: my own body's ability to nourish life. You see, I'd given birth just 18 months earlier to my own daughter, Maria. My milk had never dried up completely, something I'd hidden from the Whitmores. Embarrassed by this reminder of my own femininity in their sterile, controlled environment. But what I didn't know, what nobody knew until that desperate moment, was that my milk carried something special, something that would save their son's life and change mine forever. Let me tell you how it all began, How a woman invisible to the world became the most important person in one small boy's life. How I learned that sometimes the greatest power lies not in what you own, but in what you can give. This is my story, our story. And it's more complicated than you might imagine. The Whitmore mansion sat like a fortress on Astor Street, surrounded by other monuments to Chicago's old money. Each morning I'd walk past the homeless veterans outside the Starbucks on State Street, clutching their cardboard signs, their eyes hollow with hunger. Then I'd climb the steps to a house where leftovers worth hundreds of dollars were scraped into the garbage disposal without a thought. The contrast never stopped cutting at my heart. While they worried about their stock market portfolios and Bitcoin fluctuations, real people struggled for their next meal just blocks away. My own story started differently. I grew up in Pilsen, where my mother cleaned offices downtown and my father worked construction when his back allowed it. We weren't poor exactly, but we understood the weight of every dollar. College wasn't an option, not when my family needed my income to keep the lights on. So I learned to clean, to serve, to become invisible in the presence of wealth. It's a skill passed down through generations of women like me, women who keep other people's worlds spinning without ever being seen. When I started working for the Whitmores, their eldest daughter Caroline was just turning 16. She'd stomp through the house in designer boots that cost more than my monthly rent, screaming at her mother about parties and privileges. I'd clean up after her tantrums. The thrown makeup, the torn photographs, the cruel words she'd scratch into expensive furniture. Sometimes I wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her, to tell her how lucky she was. Instead, I'd repair the damage silently and disappear back into my corner of their world. Their son Robert was quieter, but no kinder. He'd grown up thinking servants were furniture, useful but unworthy of acknowledgement. He'd leave his clothes on the bathroom floor, expecting invisible hands to make them clean again. He'd track mud through freshly mopped hallways without a backward glance. When he brought girlfriends home, I'd prepare elaborate meals they'd barely touch, then clean up the waste while they talked about their trust funds and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Mr. Whitmore himself was a ghost in his own house. He'd leave for his downtown office before dawn and return after dark. His mind consumed with commodity prices and currency fluctuations. His investment portfolio required constant attention, monitoring grain futures, tracking precious metals, staying ahead of cryptocurrency trends that could make or lose millions in minutes. He'd built his fortune by being ruthless in business, a trait that spilled over into how he treated those he considered beneath him. To him, I was an operating expense, like electricity or water service. But it was Mrs. Whitmore who truly perfected the art of making me feel small. She had a way of speaking to me that stripped away my dignity one word at a time. Clara, you missed a spot on the mirror. Clara, the silver doesn't shine the way it used to. Clara, perhaps you're getting too old for this kind of work. Each comment was delivered with a smile, making it impossible to argue without seeming ungrateful. She was an expert at maintaining plausible deniability while systematically destroying whatever confidence I had left. The worst part was how they talked about money in front of me, as if I couldn't understand the implications. They'd discuss their assets like I was a lamp or a painting, present but unable to comprehend their world of wealth. Mrs. Whitmore would complain about her returns being down while I stood there knowing she'd made more in dividends that month than I'd earn in 5 years. They'd argue about whether to buy euros or gold, whether Bitcoin was still a smart hedge against inflation, all while I calculated how many meals their loose change could buy. Do you know what it's like to be hungry in a house full of food? To wear shoes with holes while polishing floors that cost more than most people's homes? I'd sometimes catch my reflection in their mirrors and wonder if I was disappearing, becoming as transparent as they insisted I should be. My own needs became smaller and smaller until they almost vanished entirely. I forgot what it felt like to matter, to have opinions that counted, to be seen as fully human. My daughter Maria lived with my sister Rosa in Gary, about an hour south of the city. She was growing up without me, raised by relatives who loved her but couldn't replace her mother. Every night, I'd call her before bed, listening to her small voice tell me about school, about friends, about the life I was missing. She'd ask when I was coming home, and I'd make promises I couldn't keep. "Soon, mija," I'd lie. "Mama just needs to work a little longer." The Whitmores' wealth required my poverty. Their comfort demanded my sacrifice. Their family's success was built on the pieces of mine. I sent most of my paycheck to Rosa every month. What little remained barely covered my basic needs. Generic shampoo, secondhand clothes, the cheapest food I could find. While the Whitmores worried about their investment returns and cash flow projections, I worried about whether I could afford both rent and groceries. While they diversified their portfolio across international markets, I divided my few dollars between necessities and dreams I couldn't afford to have. The isolation was the hardest part. In a house full of people, I was utterly alone. The other staff members came and went, gardeners, drivers, the occasional party planner, but I was the constant, the one who knew where every secret was hidden, every family weakness was buried. I knew about Caroline's eating disorder and Robert's gambling debts. I knew about Mr. Whitmore's affair with his secretary and Mrs. Whitmore's prescription drug addiction. I held their secrets like poison in my chest, unable to share the burden, but unable to forget what I'd seen. Then came the pregnancy that changed everything. Mrs. Whitmore, at 43, decided she wanted one more child. A fresh start, she called it. Though I suspected it was more about competing with her younger social circle than any real desire for motherhood. Her previous pregnancies had been managed by a team of specialists, her recovery handled by a parade of professionals. She'd never changed a diaper, never lost sleep to crying, never questioned whether she was doing right by her children. Money had insulated her from the actual work of parenting. When she told me she was expecting, her first concern wasn't the baby's health or her family's happiness. It was how the pregnancy would affect her social calendar. "Clara, I'll need you to take on more responsibilities," she informed me, as if the growing life inside her was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a miracle to be celebrated. I nodded and agreed, as I always did. Even as I wondered how I could possibly do more than everything I was already doing. The pregnancy progressed normally at first. Mrs. Whitmore attended her prenatal appointments at the most exclusive practices in Chicago, her medical care coordinated by concierge physicians who charged more per visit than I made in a month. She took prenatal vitamins that cost more than my weekly grocery budget and attended fitness classes designed specifically for wealthy, expectant mothers. Everything was planned, controlled, optimized for success. But sometimes, nature has other plans. Sometimes, all the money in the world can't prevent what's meant to happen. And sometimes, the solution to a rich family's problem comes from the most unexpected source. A poor woman they've never really seen, whose own body holds the key to their salvation. As Mrs. Whitmore entered her third trimester, I was entering my own quiet crisis. The extra work, the longer hours, the emotional toll of being constantly dismissed, it was wearing me down in ways I couldn't ignore. My back ached from scrubbing floors. My hands were raw from endless washing and polishing. My spirit was brittle from years of being treated as less than human. I'd started having dreams about walking away, about taking the train to Gary and never coming back. But fear kept me trapped. Fear of having no income, no place to live, no way to support my daughter. I didn't know then that my freedom was about to arrive in the smallest, most helpless package imaginable, that a tiny baby, fighting for his life, would become the catalyst for everything that followed. That my body, the same body they'd ignored and dismissed for over a decade, would prove to be worth more than all their investments combined. The contractions started on a Thursday morning in January. I was waxing the dining room table when Mrs. Whitmore called out from upstairs, her voice tight with panic. The baby was coming early, too early. By the time the ambulance arrived, her water had broken, and their carefully planned delivery at Northwestern Memorial's VIP maternity suite became an emergency race against time. I watched from the window as they loaded her into the ambulance, Mr. Whitmore climbing in beside her, his face gray with worry. For the next 3 days, the house felt like a tomb. The other children were sent to stay with relatives. The usual bustle of wealth grinding forward came to a halt. I maintained my routine, but everything felt different, suspended, as if we were all holding our breath, waiting for news. The silence was broken only by Mr. Whitmore's increasingly frantic phone calls to doctors, lawyers, and financial advisors. Even in crisis, his first instinct was to throw money at the problem. When they finally came home, it was without their son. Little Thomas weighed barely 3 pounds and was fighting for every breath in the hospital's most advanced NICU. The bills were astronomical, thousands of dollars per day for round-the-clock care. But the Whitmores weren't worried about money. Their concern was whether their wealth could buy what Thomas needed most, the strength to survive. Mrs. Whitmore returned home broken in ways I'd never seen before. Her usual composure cracked, revealing the terrified mother underneath. She'd sit in the nursery they'd prepared, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of baby furniture and toys, crying for the child who might never use any of it. For the first time in 12 years, I felt something like sympathy for her. Money couldn't fill the emptiness in her arms or quiet the fear in her heart. The specialists came and went, each offering new theories and experimental treatments. Thomas's immune system wasn't developing properly. His digestive system couldn't process standard formulas. His blood work showed deficiencies that stumped even the most experienced neonatal doctors. They tried everything science could offer: specialized nutrients, immune boosters, medications that cost more per dose than most people's monthly salary. Nothing worked. That's when Dr. Morrison suggested something that made the Whitmores recoil in horror. Sometimes, in cases this severe, donor breast milk can provide antibodies that no formula can match, he explained. It's not guaranteed, but it might be our last hope. The idea of their child depending on milk from a stranger, a poor stranger most likely, violated everything they believed about their superiority. They'd built their fortune on the idea that money could solve any problem. The suggestion that their son might need something only a poor woman could provide challenged their entire worldview. They spent days exploring alternatives. Could they pay premium prices for milk from wealthy donors? Could they hire a wet nurse from an exclusive agency? Could their money somehow create a solution that didn't require acknowledging their dependence on someone they considered beneath them? Each avenue led to the same conclusion. If they wanted to save their son, they'd have to humble themselves before someone they'd never seen as fully human. I watched this struggle from my invisible corner, my heart breaking for the baby I'd never met, but somehow loved already. I thought about my own daughter, about the months I'd nursed her in the cramped apartment Rosa and I shared in Gary. I remembered how my body had provided everything she needed, not because we could afford the best doctors or the most expensive supplements, but because nature had equipped me with what money couldn't buy. That's when I realized I might be able to help. My own milk production hadn't stopped completely after Maria was born. It was something I'd hidden from the Whitmores, embarrassed by this reminder of my own femininity in their sterile world. But what if this shameful secret was actually a gift? What if the body they'd ignored and dismissed was exactly what their dying son needed? The question was whether I'd have the courage to speak up. For 12 years, I'd trained myself to be invisible, to swallow my words, to accept whatever treatment they gave me. Could I break that pattern now? Could I risk their anger, their rejection, their disgust at the suggestion that their precious son might need something from me? Could I offer the most intimate part of myself to people who'd never seen me as worthy of basic respect? As I stood in that empty nursery, surrounded by the evidence of their desperation, I made a decision that would change all our lives forever. I decided to stop being invisible. I decided to speak up, to offer what only I could give, to risk everything for a baby who represented both their greatest hope and mine. But I had no idea what that decision would cost me. I couldn't know how offering to save their son would expose the ugliest parts of their nature and the strongest parts of mine. I couldn't predict how this act of mercy would lead to my own liberation from a life of servitude and silence. All I knew was that somewhere in a hospital across town, a tiny baby was fighting for his life, and I might be the only person who could help him win that fight. The question was whether his parents would let me try. The phone call came at 3 a.m. Mr. Whitmore's voice was hollow, defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "Clara, we need you to come to the hospital. The doctors, they say there might be one more option." His words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications neither of us was ready to face. I dressed quickly in the dark, my hands shaking as I tried to process what he might be asking of me. Northwestern Memorial's NICU was a temple to modern medicine and unlimited wealth. The corridors gleamed with equipment that cost more than most people's homes, attending to the tiniest patients money could protect. But as I followed Mr. Whitmore through those sterile halls, I realized that all their technology, all their expertise, all their vast fortune had reached its limits. Sometimes the most expensive solutions aren't the right ones. Sometimes what a dying baby needs can't be purchased with cryptocurrency or stock dividends. Thomas lay in his incubator like a fragile bird fallen from its nest. Tubes and wires covered his tiny body, machines breathing for him, monitors tracking every heartbeat. He weighed less than a bag of sugar, his skin translucent enough to show the blue veins underneath. Mrs. Whitmore sat beside him, her designer clothes wrinkled from days of hospital vigils, her usual composure completely shattered. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked at me not as hired help, but as another mother who might understand her desperation. Dr. Morrison pulled me aside, his voice clinical but kind. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand this is unusual, but we're running out of options. Baby Thomas's immune system is severely compromised. Standard formula isn't providing the antibodies he needs. Donor milk from our usual sources hasn't worked either. But your recent pregnancy, combined with your excellent health profile," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "your milk might contain exactly what he needs to survive." The request hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. They were asking me to offer the most intimate part of my body to save their child. The same people who'd treated me as invisible for 12 years were suddenly desperate for something only I could provide. The irony was almost too much to bear, their son's life depending on a woman they'd never truly seen as human. Mrs. Whitmore approached me then, her eyes red from crying, her voice broken with hope and humiliation. "Clara, I know I haven't always—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "How do you apologize for 12 years of systemic dehumanization when your child's life hangs in the balance? How do you admit that the woman you've treated as furniture might be your son's only salvation?" I looked at that tiny baby fighting for every breath and felt my heart break open. This wasn't about the Whitmores or their money or their years of treating me badly. This was about a helpless child who needed exactly what my body could provide. In that moment, my own hurt feelings seemed small compared to his desperate need. "I'll do it," I whispered. "I'll try to help him." The process was more complex than I'd imagined. First came the medical tests. Blood work, health screenings, psychological evaluations. They needed to ensure my milk was safe, that my body could produce what Thomas needed, that I was mentally prepared for what they were asking. The Whitmores spared no expense, bringing in specialists from around the world to analyze every aspect of my health. Suddenly, the invisible woman became the most important person in their universe. The results were extraordinary. Not only was my milk safe, it was perfect for Thomas's specific needs. My body produced unusually high levels of the exact antibodies his immune system lacked. The doctors couldn't explain it. Some called it luck, others called it providence. I preferred to think of it as love taking physical form. After years of giving my emotional energy to a family that barely acknowledged my existence, my body was finally offering something they couldn't ignore or dismiss, but agreeing to help was just the beginning. The daily reality of pumping milk for their child while living in their house created complications none of us had anticipated. I needed proper nutrition to maintain my milk supply, which meant the Whitmores had to acknowledge my basic human needs for the first time. I needed rest, privacy, respect for my body and its functions. Suddenly, the invisible woman required careful handling, and they had no idea how to navigate this new dynamic. The pumping schedule was demanding. Every 3 hours around the clock, I'd retreat to a room they'd hastily converted for my use. The machine's rhythmic sound became the soundtrack to my new existence, each session extracting not just milk, but somehow drawing out my years of silence and submission. With every ounce I produced, I felt my power growing. Their son needed me in a way that couldn't be purchased or negotiated. For the first time in 12 years, I was truly indispensable. Thomas began improving almost immediately. His weight increased, his breathing stabilized, his blood work showed dramatic improvements in immune function. The doctors called it remarkable, unprecedented, a medical miracle. The Whitmores called it answered prayers, though I noticed they never thanked the God who had provided their answer through my body. Their gratitude was conditional, professional, careful not to acknowledge what this arrangement really meant. As Thomas grew stronger, their behavior toward me became increasingly conflicted. They needed me desperately, but they resented that need. They were grateful for what I was doing, but uncomfortable with their dependence on someone they'd never considered their equal. Mrs. Whitmore would bring me expensive gifts, silk scarves, designer handbags, jewelry worth more than my yearly salary, but she couldn't bring herself to have genuine conversations with me or acknowledge that her son's life depended on my body's generosity. The other staff members noticed the changes immediately. Suddenly, their questions about my schedule mattered. My dietary preferences became important. My comfort and well-being affected the entire household's functioning. Some of them seemed pleased to see me finally receiving consideration. Others appeared resentful that a fellow servant had somehow elevated herself above her station. The dynamics of the house shifted in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. But the most difficult aspect was how this arrangement affected my relationship with my own daughter. Maria was old enough to understand that Mama was taking care of another baby, feeding someone else's child with milk that might otherwise have been hers. During our nightly phone calls, her questions cut straight to my heart. "Why can't you come home now, Mama? Didn't you say you were staying to take care of the baby? Isn't he better now?" How could I explain that saying Thomas's life had somehow become both my greatest purpose and my latest trap? That the Whitmores' gratitude came with invisible chains, binding me to their family through their son's continued need for my milk? That walking away now would mean abandoning a child who depended on me for survival, even though staying meant postponing my own freedom indefinitely? The financial arrangements were awkward and revealing. Mr. Whitmore tried to solve the discomfort through money, as he always did. He offered me bonuses, raises, investment opportunities in his portfolio. "You should have some Bitcoin," he suggested awkwardly. "Diversify your assets." The absurdity of a man worth hundreds of millions giving financial advice to a woman who couldn't afford her own apartment wasn't lost on either of us. His money couldn't solve the fundamental inequality between us, and his attempts to compensate me financially only highlighted how much he still didn't understand. Mrs. Whitmore took a different approach, trying to reframe our relationship as friendship rather than employment. She'd invite me to sit with her while I pumped, chattering about her social calendar and charity work as if we were equals, sharing intimate conversations. But her attempts at connection felt hollow, performed rather than genuine. She couldn't escape the dynamic we'd established over 12 years any more than I could. As Thomas approached his 3-month mark, the doctors began discussing a transition to formula. His immune system had strengthened enough that he might survive without my milk. The prospect of ending our arrangement should have felt like liberation for all of us. Instead, it brought unexpected complications and revealed truths none of us were prepared to face. The Whitmores had grown accustomed to having me available, responsive to their needs in ways that went beyond Thomas's care. They'd forgotten what life was like when I was just their maid, expected to be invisible and uncomplaining. Now that I'd proven myself essential, they couldn't imagine returning to the old dynamic. But they also couldn't figure out how to maintain the new one without acknowledging the fundamental changes it required. I found myself at a crossroads I'd never expected to face. I'd entered this arrangement to save a baby's life, but somewhere along the way, it had saved mine too. For the first time in 12 years, I'd experienced what it felt like to be truly needed, genuinely valued, impossible to ignore or dismiss. The question was whether I could hold on to that feeling once Thomas no longer needed my milk, or whether I'd slip back into invisibility the moment my usefulness ended. The answer would prove more complicated and painful than any of us could have predicted. Because saving their son's life had awakened something in me that couldn't be put back to sleep. I'd tasted respect, experienced power, felt my own worth in ways that changed me permanently. And once a woman knows her true value, it becomes very difficult for others to convince her she's worthless. But the Whitmores weren't ready for the woman I was becoming. They wanted their son to be healthy and their lives to return to normal. They wanted me to go back to being invisible, grateful and silent. They wanted to keep the miracle I'd provided while forgetting the person who had provided it. They were about to learn that some changes can't be undone, that some awakenings can't be reversed, and that a woman who has saved a life might have learned something about the value of her own. As Thomas grew stronger and more independent, requiring fewer feedings and gaining weight steadily, the Whitmores began pulling back from the intimacy our arrangement had created. The daily conversations about his progress became shorter and more clinical. Mrs. Whitmore stopped bringing gifts or attempting friendship. Mr. Whitmore returned to discussing their investment portfolio and cryptocurrency holdings as if I weren't in the room. They were reverting to their old patterns, trying to restore the comfortable distance that had defined our relationship before their crisis. But I wasn't the same person who had agreed to help them 6 months earlier. Saving Thomas's life had awakened something in me that couldn't be put back to sleep. I'd experienced what it felt like to be essential, to have my body and my choices matter in ways that affected life and death. I'd seen how quickly their superiority crumbled when they needed something only I could provide. Most importantly, I'd remembered that I was more than just their employee. I was a mother, a woman with value beyond my ability to clean their house and serve their needs. The first sign of trouble came during one of our regular medical consultations. Dr. Morrison was pleased with Thomas's progress and suggested we could begin reducing the frequency of his feedings with my milk. He's strong enough now that formula should meet most of his nutritional needs, he explained. We can probably transition him completely within the next few weeks. Mrs. Whitmore's relief was visible and immediate. That's wonderful news, she said, barely glancing in my direction. I'm sure Clara is eager to get back to her regular duties. There it was, the assumption that saving their son's life had been just another task to check off my list, that I'd be grateful to return to scrubbing floors and polishing silver after experiencing the most meaningful work of my life. But they were wrong. I wasn't eager to go back to being invisible. I wasn't prepared to pretend that what we'd shared hadn't changed everything between us, and I certainly wasn't ready to accept that my value to their family would disappear the moment Thomas no longer needed my milk. That night, I called my sister Rosa and Gary. I'm thinking about coming home, I told her. Thomas is almost ready to be weaned, and I don't think I can go back to the way things were before. Rosa was quiet for a long moment. You sure, Clara? That job pays well. And Maria's doing fine here. You don't need to uproot everything just because things feel different now. But Rosa didn't understand what I'd learned about myself in those months of saving Thomas's life. I discovered that I had value beyond my ability to serve others without complaint. I'd experienced what it felt like to be treated as an essential part of someone's world, rather than an invisible presence maintaining it. I couldn't unknow those truths, couldn't unfeel the respect I'd tasted, couldn't return to accepting crumbs when I'd learned I deserved a place at the table. The confrontation came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning that started like any other. I was preparing Thomas's feeding when Mrs. Whitmore entered the nursery with news that changed everything. "Clara, we've decided to hire a nanny," she announced, her voice carefully neutral. "Someone with formal training in infant care. We're grateful for everything you've done, of course, but now that Thomas is stronger, we need someone who can focus entirely on his development." I stared at her, my hands still on the breast pump, my body still producing the milk that had saved their son's life. "A nanny," I repeated slowly, "to replace me." "Not replace," she said quickly. "Your job was always housekeeping. You went above and beyond during the emergency, and we appreciate that. But now we need to return to normal arrangements." Normal? As if the past 6 months had been an aberration, an unfortunate disruption of the natural order where I cleaned their messes and they pretended I didn't exist. As if saving their child's life was just another example of me going above and beyond, rather than a fundamental transformation of who I was and what I was worth. "And what happens to me?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Mrs. Whitmore looked uncomfortable. "You'll continue with your regular duties, of course. We're prepared to offer you a raise in recognition of your service during this difficult time." A raise. They thought money could solve this, could compensate for the loss of purpose and meaning I'd found in caring for Thomas. They thought a few extra dollars could buy my acceptance of returning to invisibility after I'd experienced what it felt like to truly matter. I stood up slowly, unplugging the breast pump and setting it aside. "I need some time to think about this," I said. Mrs. Whitmore's face tightened. "Think about what, exactly? Clara, you have a good position here. Job security in this economy is valuable. I hope you're not considering anything rash." The threat was subtle but clear. Don't make trouble. Be grateful for what you have. Accept your place and don't reach for more. It was the same message they'd been sending me for 12 years, but I was finally ready to stop receiving it. That afternoon, I walked through Lincoln Park, watching families push strollers and chase toddlers across the grass. For the first time in years, I could imagine myself in one of those scenes, not as hired help watching other people's children, but as a mother enjoying time with my own daughter. The Whitmores had given me enough money during Thomas's treatment that I had actual savings for the first time in my adult life. Not wealth, certainly, but enough to make choices based on something other than desperation. When I returned to the house that evening, I found Mr. Whitmore waiting for me in the kitchen. "Clara, I understand my wife spoke with you today about some changes to your role here." I nodded, waiting. "I want you to know that we value everything you've done for our family. Thomas is alive because of you. We'll never forget that." He paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "But you have to understand our position. We can't have household staff becoming too attached to our children. It creates complications." Complications. As if loving their son was a professional misstep, rather than the natural result of sustaining his life with my own body. As if the bond formed through months of literally nourishing another woman's child was something that could be switched on and off according to their convenience. "I understand your position perfectly," I said quietly. "You needed me when your son was dying, and now that he's safe, you want me to go back to being invisible. You want the miracle without the person who provided it." Mr. Whitmore frowned. That's not fair, Clara. We're offering you continued employment and a substantial raise. Many people would be grateful for that kind of security." "Many people haven't spent 6 months saving your son's life," I replied. "Many people haven't experienced what it feels like to be essential to your family's survival and then watched you try to erase that experience the moment it became inconvenient." He looked genuinely surprised by my response. In 12 years of employment, I'd never spoken to him with anything approaching directness. I'd always been careful, deferential, grateful for whatever consideration they chose to show me. But saving Thomas's life had taught me something about my own worth that couldn't be unlearned. "What exactly are you asking for, Clara?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and danger. What was I asking for? Respect? Recognition? A fundamental change in how they saw me and treated me? All of those things seemed impossibly large. Too much to request from people who'd spent 12 years teaching me to expect nothing. "I'm asking to be seen," I said finally. "I'm asking to be treated like the woman who saved your son's life instead of hired help who happened to be useful during a crisis." Mr. Whitmore's expression hardened. "Clara, I think you're forgetting your place here. Yes, you helped during a difficult time and we're grateful. But that doesn't change the fundamental nature of our relationship. You work for us. We pay you. That's the arrangement." There it was, the truth they'd been trying to dress up in gratitude and raises and carefully worded appreciation. I was still just hired help to them, still someone whose feelings and needs mattered less than their comfort and convenience. The months I'd spent saving their son's life hadn't changed their fundamental view of me as someone whose primary value lay in her willingness to be invisible and uncomplaining. Something shifted inside me in that moment. A door I'd kept locked for 12 years finally opened, and anger, clean, righteous anger, poured out. Not just anger about their current behavior, but fury about every small humiliation, every dismissal, every moment of being treated as less than human while I served their needs and maintained their comfort. "My place," I repeated slowly. "Let me tell you about my place, Mr. Whitmore. My place was pumping milk every 3 hours for 6 months to save your son's life, while you worried about your cryptocurrency investments. My place was missing calls from my own daughter because your son needed me more than she did. My place was watching you panic about losing the one thing your money couldn't buy, while I gave you the one thing it couldn't purchase." His face flushed. "Clara, you're being completely inappropriate. We compensated you well for that service." "Service?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think what I did was service? Like cleaning your floors or polishing your silver? Mr. Whitmore, I sustained your son's life with my own body. I gave him antibodies that saved his immune system and nutrients that helped him grow strong. That's not service. That's sacrifice. That's love. And the fact that you can't tell the difference shows exactly why this conversation was inevitable." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of their expensive appliances. Mr. Whitmore looked at me as if I'd become a stranger, and I supposed I had. The obedient, invisible woman who'd worked for his family for 12 years was gone. In her place stood someone who'd learned her own worth by giving life to his child. "What do you want from us, Clara?" he asked finally. I thought about that question as I looked around the kitchen I'd cleaned thousands of times, at the marble countertops I'd polished until they gleamed, at the expensive appliances I'd maintained while eating my own meals at the small table tucked into the corner like an afterthought. What did I want from people who'd made it clear that they saw me as fundamentally less valuable than themselves? "I don't think you can give me what I want," I said quietly. "Because what I want is to be treated like a human being who matters, not just when you need something from me, but all the time. And I don't think you know how to do that." The next morning, I gave my notice, not just from caring for Thomas, but from working in their house at all. I'd saved enough money during the months of caring for their son to support myself and Maria while I figured out what came next. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be comfortable, but it would be mine. For the first time in 12 years, my choices would be based on what I wanted rather than what they needed. Mrs. Whitmore cried when I told her. "But Thomas loves you," she said through her tears. "How can we explain to him that you're leaving?" The irony was exquisite. For 6 months, they'd minimized my relationship with their son, insisted it was purely professional, warned against attachment and complications. Now, faced with my departure, they wanted to use that same bond to manipulate me into staying. "Tell him the truth," I suggested. "Tell him that Clara helped him when he was sick, and now that he's better, she's going to take care of her own little girl for a while." 3 days later, I packed my few belongings into 2 suitcases and took the train to Gary. Maria was waiting at Rosa's apartment, shy at first but warming quickly as I held her close and promised I wouldn't leave again. We talked late into the night about school, friends, dreams she'd tucked away during the years when Mama was always somewhere else. But the story didn't end there, because the Whitmores weren't content to let me disappear quietly back into the invisible world where they thought I belonged. They'd built their wealth on control, controlling markets, controlling investments, controlling the people who served them, and they weren't ready to accept that I was beyond their control now. 2 weeks after I'd moved back to Gary, the attacks began. It started with phone calls to my sister's neighbors, subtle questions about my character and reliability. Then came the more direct assault. Social media posts suggesting I'd stolen from them, implications that I'd been inappropriate with Mr. Whitmore, hints that my departure had been involuntary rather than my choice. The cruelest blow came in the form of a letter, supposedly from Thomas but clearly dictated by his mother. The 7-month-old baby had apparently written to tell me how much I'd hurt his family by leaving, how they'd trusted me, and I'd betrayed that trust. The letter was signed with a tiny handprint in blue ink, a detail designed to maximize emotional impact. But instead of breaking me, their attacks revealed something I hadn't fully understood about my own transformation. I was no longer the woman who absorbed their abuse silently, who accepted their version of reality without question, who believed their assessment of my worth. I'd learned something about myself in those months of saving Thomas's life that couldn't be destroyed by their manipulation or their lies. I was stronger than they'd ever imagined. I was more valuable than they'd ever acknowledged. And I was finally, completely free. The vindication came from an unexpected source. Dr. Morrison called me personally to say that he'd heard rumors about my departure and wanted to set the record straight. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I want you to know that Thomas's recovery is considered one of the most remarkable cases in our NICU's history. Your contribution saved that child's life. If the family has suggested otherwise, they're not being truthful." More importantly, he had news that changed everything. "We've been analyzing your milk samples from Thomas's treatment, and we've made some extraordinary discoveries. Your antibody profile is extremely rare. Less than 1% of the population produces the specific immunoglobulins that help Thomas recover. We'd like to invite you to participate in a research study that could help other babies with similar conditions." He paused. "The compensation would be substantial. We're talking about amounts that could change your life significantly." And suddenly the tables turned completely. The wealthy family who'd tried to dispose of me once my usefulness ended discovered that I wasn't just uniquely valuable to them. I was scientifically, medically, financially valuable to institutions far more powerful than they were. The woman they'd dismissed as easily replaceable household help was being courted by major hospitals and research facilities as the key to saving other children's lives. The research study led to others. Within 6 months, I was earning more money from my rare antibody profile than I'd made in years of cleaning their house. Medical facilities competed for my participation in their studies. Pharmaceutical companies wanted to learn from my immune system's unique properties. Suddenly, I had assets of my own, not just income, but actual wealth that could be invested, diversified, turned into long-term security for Maria and me. Mr. Whitmore, with his expertise in investment management and asset allocation, would have appreciated the irony. The woman he'd condescended to about Bitcoin and portfolio diversification now had her own financial advisors, her own investment strategy, her own growing net worth. My body, the same body they'd treated as a tool for their convenience, had become my ticket to genuine financial independence. But the real transformation wasn't financial. It was personal. I enrolled in community college, taking night classes while Maria did her homework beside me. I studied business administration and early childhood development, preparing for a future where I'd use my experience to help other mothers in similar situations. I learned about labor rights, about the economic value of care work, about the ways domestic employees are systematically undervalued and exploited. Most importantly, I learned to forgive. Not the Whitmores exactly, but the circumstances that had shaped all of us. They were products of a system that taught them their wealth, made them inherently more valuable than the people who served them. I was a product of a system that taught me my poverty made me less worthy of respect and consideration. Breaking free from those systems required changing not just my circumstances, but my fundamental understanding of my own worth. A year after leaving their employment, I received an invitation to the Whitmore's annual charity gala, the same event where I'd served drinks and collected coats for years, without being acknowledged as anything more than part of the furniture. This time, the invitation was addressed to me as a guest, recognizing my work with the research foundation that was developing treatments based on my rare antibody profile. I almost didn't go. The temptation to stay away, to avoid the discomfort of seeing them again, was strong. But Maria convinced me otherwise. "Mama, you should go," she said with the wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Not because they invited you, but because you earned the right to be there." So I bought a dress, not expensive, but beautiful, and took the train back to Chicago for one evening. The gala was held at the Art Institute, surrounded by paintings I'd admired during lunch breaks from my research work at Northwestern. I walked through the elegant crowd, champagne in hand, no longer invisible but not seeking attention either. The moment came inevitably. "Mrs. Pete." Whitmore appeared beside me as I studied a Monet, her face carefully composed, but her eyes uncertain. "Clara, I'm glad you came. You look, well, happy." "I am," I replied simply. "Thomas asks about you sometimes," she said after a moment. "He's doing wonderfully, walking, talking, completely healthy. The doctors say he'll never have any lasting effects from his early health problems." I smiled at that. "I'm glad. He's a beautiful child." An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with everything we couldn't or wouldn't say. Finally, she spoke again. "I want you to know that we've established a scholarship fund for children of domestic workers, in your name. It's our way of recognizing your contribution." It was a generous gesture, and I told her so. But I also understood what it really was, an attempt to frame my departure as their choice, my success as their gift, my transformation as something they'd enabled rather than something they'd tried to prevent. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I hope you understand that my story isn't really about your family anymore." She looked confused, and I realized that they still didn't understand what had really happened. They saw my success as a footnote to their story rather than the beginning of my own. They thought my worth was still somehow tied to their recognition of it rather than something inherent that had always existed, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "I saved your son's life," I continued gently, "but in doing that, I saved my own life too. I learned who I really was underneath all the years of being told I was invisible. That's not something you gave me. It's something I discovered I'd always had." I finished my champagne and set the empty glass on a passing server's tray, not because I expected them to clean up after me, but because I understood the dignity in all honest work. "Take care of yourselves," I told Mrs. Whitmore, "and take care of Thomas. He's going to be an extraordinary man someday." Then I walked away, through the crowd of wealthy Chicago society, past the art that had once seemed as distant and untouchable as the people who owned it, and out into the night air where my real life was waiting. Maria and I live in a small house now, nothing fancy but completely ours. I continue my work with the Research Foundation, helping develop treatments that could save other children like Thomas. I speak at conferences about the invisible women who keep wealthy households running, advocating for better wages and working conditions for domestic employees. I'm pursuing a degree in social work, planning to open a support center for immigrant women seeking employment in domestic services. But the most important change is internal. I no longer measure my worth by other people's recognition of it. I no longer wait for permission to take up space in the world. I no longer apologize for needing rest, asking for fair treatment, or expecting basic human dignity. My body saved Thomas's life, but my spirit saved mine. The milk that nourished him back to health contained more than just antibodies and nutrients. It carried love, hope, and the strength of a woman who finally learned her own value. That's a gift that can't be purchased with any amount of money, can't be managed like any investment portfolio, and can't be controlled by anyone except the woman who possesses it. Sometimes I think about other women like me, invisible, undervalued, convinced that their worth lies only in their ability to serve others without complaint. I want them to know that they're wrong. I want them to understand that their bodies, their minds, their hearts, their spirits are valuable beyond measure. I want them to realize that the people they serve need them far more than they need those people. Most of all, I want them to know that it's never too late to stop being invisible. It's never too late to demand the respect you deserve. It's never too late to discover that you were always worth more than they told you. Do you know someone who has lived this story? Someone who gave everything to a family that barely saw her humanity. Someone who discovered her worth in her darkest moment and found the courage to claim it. Have you felt invisible in your own life, undervalued despite your contributions, dismissed despite your dedication? I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments below. Let's break the silence that keeps women like us isolated and powerless. Let's celebrate the strength it takes to step out of the shadows and into the light. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe. Your support helps this message reach other women who need to hear it, women who are still living in the shadows, still believing they're worth less than the families they serve, still waiting for permission to claim their own lives. You can find more stories like this one in our special podcast series, designed for women who understand what it means to give everything and receive little in return. Click on the link to continue this journey of recognition, healing, and hope. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for seeing me, hearing me, believing that my story, that all our stories, matter. Until next time, remember, you are valuable, you are worthy, and you are never, ever invisible to those who matter most. I'll see you in the next story where another woman's courage will remind us why we must never stop fighting for our own worth.